The pandemic hit businesses hard, but for some it was an opportunity to exploit a system meant to help. Henley, a name you'll soon wish you never heard, took advantage of the chaos, orchestrating a massive COVID loan fraud scheme. In a world of government relief, Henley found a way to steal millions, leaving taxpayers footing the bill. At first glance, it may seem like a typical fraud case, but what makes Henley's operation so shocking isn't just the audacity of his actions. It's how he managed to slip under the radar for so long, all while the government desperately tried to support struggling businesses. Henley created a fraudulent empire that spanned the country, and he did it right under the noses of banks, auditors, and government agencies. We're going to peel back the layers of deception, manipulation, and corruption that allowed Henley's scheme to thrive. The scale of the operation will shock you, and the story of how he nearly got away with it will keep you on the edge of your seat. In the next hour, we'll break down the meticulous steps Henley took to manipulate the system. From the application process to the fraudulent claims, we'll show you how Henley fooled banks, government agencies, and auditors. We'll uncover how this pandemic-era scheme went unnoticed for so long and the devastating impact it had on taxpayers and businesses. Stay tuned to learn about the dark side of the COVID relief system, the players involved, and the real-life consequences for those affected. You'll also find out how authorities finally uncovered Henley's web of lies and what comes next for those who were impacted by his fraudulent empire. In 2020, as COVID-19 paralyzed businesses and caused widespread economic distress, the U.S. government responded with relief programs like the Paycheck Protection Program, PPP, and Economic Injury Disaster Loans, EIDL, designed to help struggling companies stay afloat. These programs were vital lifelines for millions of Americans and business owners, but not everyone used them as intended. Some saw these programs as an opportunity to exploit the system for personal gain. Henley, a business figure who was once trusted in the community, used these government programs to steal millions. By submitting false information and creating fake businesses, Henley was able to siphon funds meant for legitimate business owners, using them to line his pockets. Today, we're going to reveal the shocking details of how Henley exploited the system, manipulated banks, and kept his fraud hidden for months, until the truth finally came to light. Henley's story is a cautionary tale of greed, deception, and the vulnerabilities in systems meant to help those in need. Before Henley became known for his criminal activities, he was regarded as a successful businessman with a promising future. Born into a modest family, Henley's early life wasn't marked by wealth or privilege. He didn't inherit a fortune or come from a long line of business elites. Instead, Henley's rise to prominence was driven by his relentless work ethic and natural talent for finance. His climb up the corporate ladder was swift, and by the time he reached his early 30s, he was already a respected figure in the small business community. Henley's career trajectory seemed nothing short of impressive. He started out in the world of finance and quickly gained a reputation for his sharp mind and keen understanding of money management. His ability to navigate the complexities of financial systems made him an invaluable asset in the corporate world. Henley knew how to win people over with his charm and persuasive nature, gaining the trust of influential figures in business. Over time, this led to a series of successful ventures that seemed to position him for an even brighter future. However, while Henley's early career might have seemed like the blueprint for a model businessman, there was an undercurrent of ambition and desire for more that began to fuel his rise. As Henley gained influence, he started to see the business world through a different lens. The systems that had worked for him, the corporate structure, the rules, the regulations, no longer seemed like boundaries to respect. Instead, they were obstacles to be manipulated, bent, and even broken in his quest for power, status, and wealth. The more Henley climbed, the more the rules seemed like suggestions. His moral compass, once guided by a clear understanding of what was right and wrong, became clouded by ambition. Henley began to believe that success in business wasn't just about hard work and ethics. It was about dominating the system, getting ahead by any means necessary, and making the most of every opportunity, no matter how ethically questionable. He He quickly moved from running small businesses to controlling larger ones, and his talents for finance and building rapport enabled him to attract big investors. His expertise in managing complex financial structures gave him the confidence that he could manipulate the system without getting caught. By his early 30s, Henley had already built a solid foundation for what he thought would be a prosperous, untouchable future. But the price of his success was growing. His ambition was starting to push him into morally gray territory. But here's the thing. While Henley had gained everything from financial success to a growing reputation, something darker was always lurking beneath the surface. To the outside world, he was the perfect businessman, sharp, reliable, and capable of achieving what most people could only dream of. Yet, behind closed doors, Henley was a man driven by a craving for more. And it wasn't just more money. Henley wanted power. He wanted to be above the rules, beyond reproach. He wanted to be someone who controlled not only his destiny, but the destiny of others. Henley wasn't a run-of-the-mill businessman or even just a garden-variety con man. What made Henley dangerous was his mind. He wasn't impulsive or careless in his actions. Henley was calculated, methodical, and strategic. He wasn't operating in the same world as most people. He viewed the corporate and financial world as a game, and in his mind, he was going to win at all costs. What made Henley so dangerous was his ability to blend in, to be the person everyone trusted. His charm and charisma weren't just surface-level traits. They were tools he expertly used to gain access to key people, businesses, and resources. Henley could convince anyone that he was reliable, knowledgeable, and trustworthy. He wasn't just building a network. He was building a series of stepping stones for himself, each one designed to lead him to the next level of power. Psychologically speaking, Henley's actions reflect the mindset of someone who doesn't see the world in terms of moral absolutes, but as a world full of opportunities to exploit. He saw people as tools and relationships as transactions. He didn't care about ethics, he cared about results. In his mind, the ends justified the means. Henley wasn't driven by immediate financial need. He had the resources to support himself comfortably, but by something more profound, the desire for power and control. This drive is often linked to people who can't accept being just successful. They need to dominate. To Henley, the rules of business were just guidelines. If he had to manipulate them, distort them, or break them entirely to come out on top, so be it. He was untouchable in his mind. No one could touch him. As Henley's career progressed, he didn't just want to succeed, he wanted to be untouchable. He wanted to be in a position where he could make the rules and shape the world to fit his vision. This kind of power-seeking mentality drove him further and further into morally bankrupt decisions, eventually setting him on a path where his deceit wasn't just a choice. It became a necessity to maintain his grip on the success he had built. Henley's greed wasn't just about amassing wealth. It was about creating an empire where he was above reproach. Nothing was off limits for him. No tactic, no strategy, no boundary was too sacred to cross. In his eyes, the world was his for the taking, and he would take what he wanted, even if it meant destroying others in the process. As the pandemic swept through the globe, it created chaos, panic, and desperation. For the average person, it was a time of uncertainty and fear. But for Henley, it was an opportunity, a perfect storm. With businesses shuttering and people struggling to keep their livelihoods intact, the U.S. government launched relief programs, like the Paycheck Protection Program, PPP, to help businesses stay afloat. But while most businesses were using the relief funds for their intended purpose, Henley had a different idea. Henley saw the pandemic as his chance to strike. With the world reeling, the government's financial safety nets were in place, but they were vulnerable. Henley's mind began working, calculating, manipulating, and ultimately exploiting the system designed to help the very people who were struggling. Where others saw lifelines, Henley saw a gold mine. The government was dishing out billions in relief funds, and he could claim a piece of that pie without anyone noticing. Driven by his insatiable craving for wealth, Henley saw an unlimited opportunity to take advantage of the system. This time, however, he wasn't just scamming individual investors. He was manipulating the very government system designed to save businesses. His operation would be large, sophisticated, and so intricate that it would take authorities months, even years, to uncover. Henley didn't just want to survive this pandemic, he wanted to thrive, and in the process, he would rob millions of dollars from taxpayers, all while the world was focused on survival and recovery. Henley's scheme started innocently enough. Apply for government-backed loans, provide fake business records, and watch the money flow in. The Paycheck Protection Program, PPP, was introduced to help struggling businesses keep their employees on payroll during the pandemic. The government offered a lifeline to businesses that were affected by the crisis, with the understanding that the loans would be forgiven if certain conditions were met. But Henley, with his knack for manipulation, saw an opportunity to exploit the system. And that's exactly what he did. As businesses across the country scrambled to apply for relief, Henley had already set his plan into motion. The PPP was designed to help businesses weather the storm, but for Henley it was a perfect cover, a perfect storm of circumstances that would allow him to secure massive sums of money under false pretenses. Henley didn't just submit one application. He submitted several, each one meticulously crafted to appear legitimate. But instead of helping struggling businesses, he was building a fraudulent empire. Henley created fake businesses, inflated his revenue numbers, and fabricated employee data, all the ingredients necessary for a successful fraud operation. He wasn't working with just a single loan. He was securing multiple loans for multiple fake businesses, taking advantage of the way the system was designed to help businesses stay afloat. But Henley wasn't helping anyone except himself. His goal was clear: siphon as much money as possible from government relief funds before anyone caught on. Henley's deep knowledge of business processes and his ability to manipulate financial systems played a major role in how he pulled off the scheme. One of the most critical aspects of his operation was his ability to create fake documents that would stand up to scrutiny. He knew exactly what the banks and government agencies wanted to see: proof of revenue, payroll records, tax filings, and he delivered it. Using his access to accounting software and business data, Henley quickly produced fake tax returns, fabricated bank statements, and even altered payroll records. These documents were carefully constructed to mirror legitimate ones, but they were nothing more than cleverly designed fakes. Henley wasn't just submitting random numbers, he was exploiting the exact requirements of the loan programs. By inflating his reported revenue, he made his fake businesses appear more successful than they were. By inflating the number of employees, he justified the amount of loan money he could request. It wasn't just one fraudulent loan application. It was dozens, each with a perfectly crafted set of fake documents to make everything look legitimate. With this, Henley was able to convince banks and government agencies that these fake businesses were real, operating entities, and he started raking in millions from the PPP fund. The authorities, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of applications, simply couldn't keep up with the fraudulent ones slipping through the cracks. For a while, it worked perfectly. Henley was living the dream. His fraudulent scheme was running smoothly, and the money kept coming in. Millions of dollars flowed into his accounts, and the authorities had no clue. He used the money to fund his lavish lifestyle, paying off personal expenses, buying luxury goods, and funding what appeared to be legitimate businesses. But was Henley working alone? How did he manage to pull this off without raising suspicion? Were there others behind the scenes, helping him craft this web of lies? As the money continued to pour in, Henley grew bolder. He kept a low profile, constantly shifting his focus from one business to another, always staying one step ahead of the authorities. As Henley's fraudulent empire grew, so did the complexity of his operations. He had successfully convinced banks, government agencies, and auditors that he was just another entrepreneur doing his part to survive in the pandemic economy. But was he really that smart? Or was someone else behind the scenes pulling the strings? While Henley thought he had outsmarted the system, he was not as untouchable as he thought. The fraud wasn't going unnoticed for long. Questions started to be raised about the sudden surge in loans issued to businesses that didn't seem to exist. Investigators started to connect the dots, but Henley's web of deception was thick, and breaking through it would take time. It wasn't long before Henley's scheme started to show signs of unraveling. One of his own business partners, or an employee, someone who had access to the company's sensitive records, became suspicious. They saw inconsistencies in the financial data, discrepancies that couldn't be explained by simple error. They began to connect the dots and realized that something wasn't right. Initially, the whistleblower tried to approach Henley, raising concerns about what was happening behind the scenes. But Henley, with his charm and persuasive nature, dismissed these concerns, downplaying the seriousness of the issue. It wasn't the first time Henley had brushed off a minor problem. His entire career had been built on a foundation of minimizing risk and creating a false sense of security. Eventually, the whistleblower realized that Henley's deception wasn't a one-time mistake. It was systemic. The way Henley manipulated his company's records, how he fabricated documents, and how he lied to government agencies were no longer minor infractions. They were illegal activities, potentially involving millions of dollars. The whistleblower couldn't ignore it anymore, so they took the brave step of reporting what they had uncovered. It wasn't an easy decision. Henley was a charismatic figure, someone with connections to influential individuals, and exposing his crimes meant taking a massive risk. But this whistleblower knew that the public needed to know the truth. They contacted the authorities, alerting them to the discrepancies, and after some back and forth, investigations were launched. The authorities were initially skeptical. After all, Henley had built a reputation as a successful businessman, someone who seemed to be doing everything by the book. The evidence provided by the whistleblower was just the first, small piece of a much larger puzzle. Investigators couldn't immediately prove that Henley was running a fraud scheme. But as they began digging deeper, they started to uncover disturbing patterns of financial mismanagement and blatant deceit. Henley's web of lies was far more complex than anyone had anticipated. The operation was spread across several companies, all of them carefully crafted to look legitimate on paper. Henley had used his deep understanding of financial systems and corporate structures to create layers of protection, each shell company acting as a separate entity, each one funneling money into Henley's personal accounts. Over the next few months, investigators from multiple agencies, most notably the Small Business Administration, SBA, the FBI, and the Department of Justice, DOJ, began to examine Henley's financial records with a fine-tooth comb. They started identifying suspicious patterns of funding, loans that were applied for under false pretenses, inconsistent revenue reports, and payroll records that didn't match the number of employees Henley claimed to have. In each case, Henley had inflated the value of his businesses and manipulated the system to gain access to large amounts of government relief funding. Authorities started connecting the dots. Financial institutions had granted Henley loans based on fabricated documents. Investors had been duped into pouring money into non-existent companies, and millions in taxpayer dollars had been funneled into his personal accounts. But Henley wasn't stupid. He knew how to hide his tracks. Each fraudulent record was backed by seemingly legitimate documents, making it incredibly difficult to prove intent. The financial world was complex, and Henley had learned to manipulate it to his advantage. As the investigation went on, the stakes became higher. The financial trail was like a labyrinth, with layers of misdirection at every turn. With each new lead, investigators would uncover more fraud, more shell companies, more fake payrolls, more doctored bank statements, but still Henley had managed to stay one step ahead. He had been using his wealth and influence to cover his tracks and manipulate the narrative. Despite mounting evidence, Henley was still operating with impunity. His charm and connections kept the authorities at bay. He was confident, calm, and above all, he was used to getting away with it. The investigators knew they were close, but every time they thought they had him cornered, he would vanish into the background, hiding in plain sight. The pressure was on. Could they bring him to justice before he disappeared again? Then something happened, something that would change the course of the investigation. A new piece of the puzzle fell into place, and it would set off a chain reaction that would eventually lead to Henley's capture. Henley's undoing came when investigators began focusing on one of his biggest transactions. a loan request that had seemed legitimate on the surface but had raised a red flag during the auditing process. This loan had been processed quickly, with a large sum requested to restructure and grow a new business venture. It seemed normal at first, but when auditors dug deeper, they found inconsistencies in the company's revenue projections. They discovered that Henley had falsified tax returns and created fake invoices to cover up the discrepancies. They traced the loan directly to his personal account. It was the breakthrough they needed. But now they had to act fast before Henley realized he was under scrutiny. The authorities acted swiftly. They coordinated a joint operation between federal agencies and state-level law enforcement. Henley was targeted with a subpoena for his financial records, and investigators managed to seize a number of his assets and accounts. The pieces were now falling into place, and the walls were closing in on Henley. Henley's reaction was one of shock and disbelief. He never thought this day would come. He believed his empire was untouchable. But with his assets being frozen and his fraudulent activities exposed, Henley did what many criminals do when they realize the game is up. He fled. Henley went underground. With his wealth and resources, he was able to disappear for a while, evading law enforcement once again. But this time, investigators were ready. They tracked his every move, monitoring his financial transactions and communications. The net was closing in, and it was only a matter of time before he was caught. As the manhunt escalated, Henley's whereabouts were finally tracked to a safe house in a remote area. Authorities surrounded the location, and after a tense standoff, Henley was apprehended. It wasn't easy. Henley had been preparing for this moment, but he couldn't outrun the inevitable. The fall of his empire was complete. The news spread like wildfire. Henley, once seen as a business genius, was now facing charges of fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. The amount stolen? Over $100 million in government relief funds and investor money. After months of painstaking investigation, the authorities had gathered enough evidence to bring Henley to justice. He had been living a life of luxury, moving seamlessly between high-end homes, expensive cars, and private jets. To the outside world, Henley was still the self-made businessman, the guy who knew how to make money and navigate the complexities of finance. But beneath that polished exterior was a man responsible for a web of lies, manipulation, and stolen wealth. His empire had come crashing down, and now the law was finally closing in. Henley, once untouchable, was no longer invincible. The arrest was nothing short of dramatic. Henley had been tiptoeing around the truth for months, but it wasn't enough to protect him any longer. On a cold autumn morning, federal agents, SWAT teams, and law enforcement officers surrounded Henley's luxury estate. The operation was swift and calculated. Henley was escorted out of his mansion, his hands cuffed, his face blank with shock. For the man who had once been so confident, the arrest was a humbling moment. He knew it was over. As Henley was led away in handcuffs, the media frenzy began. The public had already begun to turn on him, and now the reality was hitting them. The man they had once trusted was a criminal mastermind. The charges against him were staggering: fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and theft of over $100 million in government relief funds and investor money. Henley was facing decades behind bars. His empire was dismantled, and his assets, properties, luxury cars, and bank accounts were seized by authorities as part of the investigation. His arrest made headlines across the country. For a moment, Henley was no longer a businessman with a bright future. He was the face of corporate greed and manipulation. He had been living in a world of illusion, but now that illusion was shattered. The public had seen the fall of a so-called financial genius, and the consequences were just beginning to unfold. The fallout from Henley's crimes rippled through the business world, shaking the foundations of the financial community. Those who had once looked up to Henley, his peers, investors, and employees, were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered trust. Henley had been a star in the business world, a man with a reputation for making profitable ventures and taking calculated risks. But behind the scenes, he had been running a massive fraud scheme that not only deceived investors, but also exploited government relief programs meant to help struggling businesses. Small businesses, particularly those in the pandemic-stricken service industry, were hit the hardest. Henley's fraudulent applications for government loans and grants had diverted millions of dollars away from businesses that genuinely needed them. The businesses that were left out of the relief efforts struggled to stay afloat, their owners left wondering how their applications were ignored, while Henley's fraudulent schemes were allowed to thrive. Investors who had placed their trust in Henley lost everything. Many had put their life savings into his ventures, believing they were supporting a businessman with a bright future. Instead, they found themselves with nothing, bankrupt, devastated, and bitter. The emotional toll was just as damaging as the financial one. Employees, too, were affected by Henley's crimes. Many of them had worked for his companies, believing they were part of a growing, successful business. When Henley's fraud was revealed, they were left jobless, with nothing but empty promises and unpaid wages. But the most concerning fallout was from the stolen government funds. The U.S. government, already grappling with the economic impacts of the pandemic, had to spend millions of dollars to track down the stolen funds and recover them. The funds Henley had stolen were meant to keep businesses open and employees working. But Henley had taken advantage of this crisis for his own personal gain. It became clear that the effects of his crime reached far beyond just the financial world. This was a crime that had real-world consequences for regular people, many of whom were already struggling due to the pandemic. While Henley's actions were criminal, the true victims were the ones left in the wake of his lies. Some had lost homes, others had lost their businesses, and many had lost their livelihoods. Small businesses had been counting on government relief to survive the shutdowns caused by COVID-19. Instead, they were left empty-handed, their applications for loans and grants pushed aside to make room for Henley's fraudulent requests. Businesses that were legitimate, struggling to keep their employees paid and their doors open, were left without the support they needed to recover. Then there were the employees, those who had worked hard for Henley's companies, believing they were building something worthwhile. When Henley's fraud was exposed, many employees found themselves suddenly out of work, without pay, and without the benefits they had been promised. Investors, many of whom had placed their trust in Henley's ability to make sound financial decisions, were left with nothing. Their investments had been diverted into a scheme that never had any real value. The money they had invested in Henley's companies was gone, and they were left to deal with the fallout. But the question remained, was Henley truly remorseful for the destruction he had caused, or was he simply regretting the fact that he had been caught? As Henley sat in the courtroom facing the charges against him, the public waited for his reaction. Was he a man truly sorry for what he had done? Or was he just a man who got caught in the act of playing a dangerous game with other people's lives? The courtroom drama played out, with victims speaking out about how Henley's actions had ruined their lives. One by one, investors, employees, and small business owners told their stories. Some broke down in tears, others stood defiantly, but all shared the same sentiment: they had been betrayed. Henley's response? Silence. He remained stoic, barely acknowledging the devastation his actions had caused. The lack of remorse was chilling. This was no ordinary white-collar criminal. Henley was a man who had orchestrated a scheme of monumental proportions without ever once questioning the consequences. Was he really sorry for the lives he had ruined? Or was his only regret that he had been caught? After months of courtroom drama, Henley was finally sentenced. The scale of his crime, the amount of money stolen, and the long-term impact on victims weighed heavily in the judge's decision. Henley was handed a hefty prison sentence, decades behind bars, along with a significant fine that would never fully repay the damage he had done. The media, too, had a field day with Henley's sentencing. Headlines screamed about the rise and fall of a businessman who had once been lauded as a success story, only to become the face of corporate greed and corruption. Henley had gone from being the darling of the business world to a cautionary tale, one that would serve as a warning for those who believe they can manipulate the system without consequences. Henley's story is a stark reminder of the dangers of corporate greed, manipulation, and fraud. It shows just how far someone will go to maintain a facade of success, and the damage that can result when those in power choose to exploit others for personal gain. His arrest and sentencing were the beginning of the end for his empire, but for the victims, the impact will last a lifetime. The damage caused by Henley's actions went beyond dollars and cents. It was about trust, betrayal, and the destruction of lives. Justice has been served. But as we reflect on Henley's story, we must ask ourselves, how many more like him are out there, waiting for their moment to exploit the system? And what can we do to ensure that those who try to manipulate the system are held accountable? Henley's crimes weren't just the actions of one man. They were a manifestation of something far larger and more systemic. They serve as a stark reminder of the dangers lurking beneath the surface of the financial world, especially in times of crisis. The Paycheck Protection Program, PPP, and Economic Injury Disaster Loans, EIDL, were designed to help businesses struggling during the COVID-19 pandemic to keep employees on payroll and provide economic relief. But Henley's audacious fraud turned this lifeline into a source of exploitation. What started as a well-intended government initiative became a tool for Henley's greed. By manipulating the system, creating fake companies, and falsifying records, he was able to steal millions of dollars that were meant to save businesses and keep people employed. His actions not only robbed the government, but also left behind countless victims, small businesses, investors, employees, all of them impacted by his deceit. For them, the program that was supposed to provide relief became the very mechanism of their financial downfall. But Henley's story doesn't just expose his personal greed. It highlights vulnerabilities within the government's systems, vulnerabilities that allowed fraud to flourish. At a time when the government was desperately trying to provide economic relief, systems were put in place quickly, without the necessary safeguards. And while the speed of these relief programs was essential, it also created the perfect storm for exploitation. The fraud Henley orchestrated revealed the weaknesses in government oversight, financial monitoring, and the lack of transparency in the distribution of relief funds. Henley was able to pull off a sophisticated operation, showing just how easy it was for someone with the right knowledge, connections, and ruthlessness to exploit a broken system. With his understanding of finance, he manipulated the very tools meant to protect businesses, slipping through cracks in the system and taking advantage of loopholes. But the damage goes far beyond just the stolen money. This case exposed the need for more stringent checks, more effective tracking of government funds, and a better understanding of who is actually benefiting from these programs. As we reflect on this fraud, we must also think about what it says about human nature. The same systems that were designed to protect and help can so easily be twisted and manipulated by those seeking personal gain. In times of crisis, this manipulation becomes even easier, as people are desperate for any form of relief or solution. Henley's ability to exploit the system and steal millions from taxpayers should serve as a wake-up call to both the public and policymakers. The most chilling aspect of this fraud is not just the amount of money stolen, but the scale at which it was carried out. Henley didn't just take advantage of one person or one business. He created an empire based on lies, a global network of deceit that stretched across multiple states and financial institutions. His ability to maintain the facade of a successful businessman, all while operating behind a veil of manipulation, shows how dangerous unchecked power can be. Now, as we examine Henley's actions and the system he exploited, we must ask ourselves, what can we learn from this? How can we protect against similar frauds in the future? First and foremost, we must recognize that fraud doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens when systems become too easy to manipulate, when there's a lack of transparency, and when safeguards are either ignored or inadequately designed. Henley was able to exploit the gap between government intentions and the ability to monitor and enforce those intentions. The pandemic relief funds were meant to be a lifeline, but for Henley, they became a golden opportunity to siphon funds from the very system that was supposed to help. The government's quick implementation of relief programs, while necessary, didn't come with the adequate protections to prevent someone like Henley from taking advantage of it. This fraud was not only about Henley, it's about the systemic weaknesses that allowed him to manipulate the system so easily. The system itself lacked the necessary checks and balances to catch fraudulent activity quickly enough, and Henley's success shows just how vulnerable the entire process was. What this teaches us is that when systems are rushed into place without enough time to ensure they're secure, fraudsters can exploit the gaps, and the very people who need the help end up paying the price. To prevent future fraud like this, we need better oversight, more effective tracking systems, and a more transparent process when distributing government funds. But the responsibility doesn't fall solely on the government. The public also needs to remain vigilant. Fraud can happen anywhere, whether it's a small scam or a larger, more intricate scheme like Henley's. We need to be aware of the potential for fraud at every level, whether it's in the business world or in our daily lives. In the business world, those who think they can get away with something, as Henley did, are often emboldened by the lack of accountability. It's clear that more stringent controls and better auditing systems are essential for preventing this kind of deception. Having a transparent, well-documented process for loan applications and monitoring funds is key to protecting the taxpayers' money. As for Henley, he's the cautionary tale of what happens when greed overpowers integrity. His actions highlight the dangerous consequences of financial manipulation and fraud. But in many ways, Henley's story is just one example of a much larger problem that needs to be addressed in both the public and private sectors. If this story shocked you, don't let it be just another tale of corruption that gets swept under the rug. The lessons here are important, not only for the government and businesses, but also for every citizen who depends on a functional system to ensure fairness. This is about more than just one man. It's about creating a future where trust in the financial system can be restored. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on these important issues. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode that exposes fraud, financial corruption, and what you can do to protect yourself. Together, we can work towards a more accountable and transparent financial system, one that serves the people, not the fraudsters.